Christianity has really bad PR, and a lot of it has to do with the religious right or Christian conservatives. Again, the religious right or Christian conservatives also have internal divides and subgroups. But I'm generalizing here to what the majority of people who call themselves Christian and who call themselves conservative in the US believe and behave like.
Your parents obviously did not love you. They hated you.
Religious right advocate for policies and legislation that align with their flavor of conservatism. This includes opposing abortion and being pro-life, establishing and enforcing traditional family values and opposing LGBTQ plus rights, and trying to add more religion into education. They also have a kind of puritanical skew where they try to censor media and push their values into mainstream culture. The public sees that, and they see Christianity as a old conservative religious nut that's stuck in their bubble of a bygone tradition. It's not a good look. There's another weird ideological framework that's brewing in America. Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism merges national identity and Christianity, and it asserts that governments need to promote Christian values in public life, policies, and legal system. It asserts that a nation should be governed by Christian values and that governments need to enforce this in public life, their legislative framework, as well as every other area where there's a government domain. Christian nationalism asserts that a nation should be run by Christian values and that governments need to enforce these Christian values in policies, laws, and public life. It often implies that Christianity needs to have a privileged role in defining and shaping the national identity and culture, policies, and the way governments are run within a nation. The Christian right uses Christian nationalist rhetoric like a divine purpose or religious heritage in order to motivate more people in this camp to go out to vote for certain policies. And it's no surprise this kind of Christian nationalism is making a comeback, with societies becoming more secular and the church sort of losing power and its grip on society. Often Christian nationalists mobilize voters from their own advocacy groups as well as evangelical churches in order to endorse a specific conservative candidate that promotes their values. They're essentially trying to get power through political means. And it's starting to sound a bit fascist. What's the relationship between fascism and Christian nationalism? Now, they're separate and distinct ideologies, but they share things in common, like being ultra-nationalistic, being very authoritarian, and very exclusionary. Recent Christian nationalist movements have really exemplified these features. They're super authoritarian, super nationalistic, and super exclusionary. They often call for the merging of church and state. They want to enforce biblical laws, and they view certain demographic groups as threats. Very fascist. Now fascist regimes, why can't I say that? Now, fascist regimes in the past have historically used religion and religious institutions in order to meet their ends, but they're not essentially Christian. They don't care about Christianity. That's what's different about Christian nationalism. They want to put Christianity front and center of a nation's identity and governance. Christian nationalist movements aren't always fascist. They become fascist when they adopt authoritarian policies and suppress dissent in order to defend religious values. They move closer to fascist-like structures when they combine this religious zeal with political power. Really, the Dark Ages. Is Christianity essentially committed to conservative values? Is Christian doctrine inherently bigoted? No, of course not. These views on abortion, gay rights, and purity are based on a very narrow reading of the Bible. These political views have been largely developed by the church and its contrived morality that's been developed throughout history. We need to take a closer look at the cultural influences throughout history that have embedded itself into biblical interpretation and how that has formed into this church morality that we have today. As a historical text, the Bible is a collection of a bunch of books stuck together, and they all have different cultures, genres, histories, and theological perspectives. The biblical canon as we know it didn't even exist until about the 4th century, where a bunch of people decided on 27 books for the New Testament. What's important to note is that these 27 books were pulled out of their historical context. And while there is some rhyme and reason to why those 27 books, there's still other texts that they refused. There's a bunch of other texts that didn't make the cut, these apocryphal books. Now the complexity increases when theologians and people in the church try to extract these ethical principles out of these very different books. When they do this, obviously there's going to be a bias when they interpret things based on their culture, their self-interest, and it's going to paint a very inaccurate picture of morality. For example, homosexuality is condemned by a literal reading of Leviticus. But the question arises, are Christians supposed to be extracting literal ethical rules from a text that reflects an ancient culture and their norms? Or are they supposed to see the context of the literature and try to extract more nuanced principles? You have to understand that Leviticus reflects the moral, legal, and ritualistic concerns of ancient Israelites who were tribal agricultural societies. Understanding this cultural background helps to explain the focus on purity, temple worship, and ancient forms of justice. The function of these laws in Leviticus were to distinguish the Israelites from neighboring pagan nations using strict moral codes and rituals. The lessons in Leviticus aren't literal, they're allegorical and symbolic. Purity laws are supposed to symbolize spiritual cleanliness, and they're not just empty physical gestures. Leviticus is primarily about God's covenant with Israel and what Israel needs to do to maintain this relationship with God through obeying the rules and following these ritualistic practices. The more nuanced reading of Leviticus is that we need to look at the spiritual principles of these ritualistic laws. Things like reverence for the sacred, respect for life, or enforcing community justice. I see Leviticus as pushing Christians to think more about ethics, social responsibility, and what it means to revere the sacred in a secular society.
We got Henny, we got Saints, we got Cookie.
This approach to interpretation isn't new. We do this with other pieces of literature all the time. For example, look at the story of Icarus. Before he was a Super Smash Bros. Character, he was part of a Greek myth. Icarus's father gave him a pair of wings to fly around and warned Icarus that you shouldn't fly too close to the sun. Icarus, of course, flew too close to the sun. The wax that held the wings together melted, and he fell into the sea to his death. Now, do we read this text literally and extract the ethical rule? If given a pair of wings, we should not fly too close to the sun? Or is it a fiction based on the historical context, and it has a more nuanced principle of warning against hubris or overreach without listening to wise counsel? I think the latter. Other conservative commitments or pieces of church morality are really just a product of historical contingency. The Bible doesn't explicitly mention abortion, and the Christian interpretation on this topic have varied historically. The idea of sexual purity largely is a product of church tradition. It's been heavily influenced by Greco-Roman ethics as well as medieval teachings on sin and virtue. While Christian institutions have been traditionally and historically associated with forms of bigotry, things like colonialism, misogyny, and racism. They're largely products of historical power struggles, institutional corruption, and nothing in the doctrine supports bigotry. In fact, it condemns bigotry. Some Christian communities throughout history have actively driven social reform. Things like poverty alleviation, civil rights, or refugee advocacy. Now you might ask, isn't your interpretation of a more liberal Christianity just another interpretation? Isn't it possible that true Christianity actually is more conservative, possibly more bigoted, and you're just creating this new liberal Christian sect, like a new Christianity, like a new atheism? Maybe. But I don't think I'm doing anything new. I'm just echoing a lot of old ideas. This area of scholarship in particular is called hermeneutics, or the theory and methodology of interpretation or exegesis of a particular text. Just like any historical text, there are better and worse ways of interpreting the Bible. And what scholars do is argue about what the better interpretation is. And that's what we're doing here. The reason we don't see this more nuanced and sophisticated version of Christianity is because that's not the version of Christianity that we have around us. It's true that conservative Christians are going to argue that I'm a heretic, I'm misinterpreting the text, I'm going to hell, and that their approach to Christianity is the right one. But I can only follow what I think is most true, and I think this interpretive approach is the closest one to true Christianity. Admittedly, I'm probably missing a lot of nuance here, but this is a YouTube video, and there's only so much theology research I can do sober. There might be a useful analogy here to draw between interpreting the Bible and, say, the US Constitution.
I'm gonna steal the Declaration of Independence.
One dominant camp of interpreting the Constitution, called the originalists, assert that the US Constitution needs to be read within the original author's original intent, as well as the original public meaning. Like literal interpretations of the Bible, we're supposed to understand the text as a fixed and timeless piece that we look at through the lens of the original author. But even the staunchest originalists today, while they hold on to their originalist principles, admit that new precedents can develop or cases can apply rules in new ways. Literalists, on the other hand, understand words to be unchanging and divinely inspired, and they don't care about any theological, scientific, or philosophical developments. You're going to end up with very absurd literal readings, like the world being created in 7 days. And this conflicts with very basic understandings of the natural world and scientific progress. You're also going to be committed to literal pieces of archaic morality situated in an ancient time when survival was difficult, women were treated as property, and civil rights were unheard of.
It's in your blood.
That's racist.
Your soul.
That's racist.
Now, switching gears, in Canada, our approach to interpretation of our Constitution is different. Surprise, we have a Constitution. A lot of Canadians also don't know that we have a Constitution Act of 1867. Our approach to interpreting the Constitution is what's called living tree constitutionalism. It's an entirely different camp from originalism. Living tree constitutionalists understand the Constitution as a dynamic and evolving document, and they understand that interpretation needs to be in light of contemporary social values. For doctrines, the trunk of the tree can largely remain in place, but the branches and the leaves need to grow and change with the times. Now, what I think is the core problem with modern Christianity is that these peripheral debates into these political issues have become very central in the church somehow. Christianity needs to separate itself from politics. It needs to distance itself from the religious right. If Christians want to engage with the people and make society better, they need to start by focusing on the marginalized, like Jesus did. And it just so happens that the marginalized are the people that Christian conservatives don't really like. The poor, the refugees, the minorities, or the LGBTQ+. What happened to Christianity today? What's the matter with Christians? Why are they like this? Well, let's go straight to the source. What makes Christians? The institution of Christianity, the church. I think Christianity's bad PR begins and ends with the church. Churches have lost their focus, scope, and original purpose. Churches aren't meant to dive into political issues or do all the thinking for Christians or police their own form of morality. Churches are supposed to guide people to truly follow Jesus. And churches have failed Christians. And I'm not even talking about the bad ones. The mega churches with millionaire pastors or the ones with sex scandals. I'm talking about the average church in America. They led churchgoers astray by focusing on their weird church morality instead of the fundamental teachings of Christianity. Again, church morality isn't Christian morality. They're different. Church morality is this weird parasitic mutant of Christian morality. It's another remnant of medieval churches. There are weird hierarchies and power dynamics. There's weird rules and repressions that have sustained through generations. You're not supposed to swear or have premarital sex, but why is that put front and center in the church instead of focusing on, say, victims of sexual abuse or helping the homeless or advocating for the marginalized in society? Is it a coincidence that the restrictions on foul language have also been emphasized in upper class etiquette and morality? Or that virginity was historically linked to patriarchal property rights? We saw a history of people co-opting the church in order to get more power and further their own agenda. It's going to have lasting impacts on Christianity. I think the church is carrying on their historical blunders and not learning from their mistakes. The overemphasis on church morality seems to give us really hypocritical, arrogant, and preachy Christians. They're sheltered from engaging in any real social issues, and they're just constantly fed this church morality that's got this conservative overtone. This focus on proselytizing while being sheltered from the rest of society leads to really invasive, insensitive, and out-of-touch Christians. The church needs to update its approach to doctrine. I'm seriously not sure how this can be done and what it takes to change a lot of people's minds. It's like trying to move someone who's far right to far left.
I'm so fucking happy for you.
Maybe education. Maybe start by educating the people in power at the churches and hope it trickles down. There's certainly a lot of good scholarship out there, and it's more readily accessible than ever. But maybe there's too much information out there and too little time. I know pastors or church leaders aren't expected to be scholars, but there's also the risk that they take bits and pieces of scholarship and misconstrue it and use it to try to reaffirm their own beliefs. It's common for people not to change their views, and it's possible that church leaders see their commitments to their theological beliefs, however obtuse it may be, as a virtue, and they might ultimately not consider alternative points of view. I see the pattern of presenting facile accounts of other religions, ignoring the complexities of social issues, and really disregarding the nuance when it comes to political problems. But it's not their fault, partly because of their job, partly because of this sort of dogmatic church morality. They're insulated from the outside world, and they really only experience a small slice of it in their life. And maybe it's not their job to radically change the moral commitments and institutions of the church that have survived generations. Maybe more direct education is the answer. Maybe we need to go directly to the churchgoers and try to convince them. Now, the critique of the church and churchgoers and their moral failings is nothing new. Many people have done this before. We saw Martin Luther and his 95 Theses, but there's so many more throughout history that have been so impactful. Thomas Aquinas, for example, critiqued certain church practices, and he advocated for reason alongside faith. Pascal criticized the hypocrisy of the church, and he tried to have a more reasoned account for Christianity, but he also acknowledged that reason has its limits and that there needs to be an emphasis on faith. John Locke, he criticized religious intolerance, and he also emphasized the separation of church and state. Paul Tillich critiqued traditional religious dogma, and he reinterpreted Christianity through existential and philosophical frameworks. But my personal favorite is a guy named Søren Kierkegaard, a Danish philosopher that lived from 1813 to 1855. Kierkegaard argued that the institution of the church has turned Christianity into this bureaucratic system that emphasized rituals and dogma over authentic faith. He criticized the Danish Lutheran Church for being too entangled with the state and societal respectability over genuine spiritual transformation. He viewed the clergy as being more concerned with power, social status, and political control over guiding people to experience authentic Christianity. He would describe them as officials rather than spiritual leaders, and he accused them of reducing Christianity to a bunch of moralistic preachings and strict rules. He argued that the church leaders promoted a Christianity without Christ, and he argued that they reduced the radical teachings of Jesus to a bunch of moral platitudes and political allegiances. Kierkegaard argued that Jesus was a radical figure that opposed hypocrisy and social privilege. You can see why I like this guy. He should have made this video. Alas, he's dead. Modern Christianity and the churches of this day are still the way Kierkegaard describes churches in his day. It's become a social club with a touch of spirituality mixed in. People like to be a part of big crowds and being a part of something that's bigger than them. At least that's what they told me at the AA meetings. It's sacrament wine, how bad could it be? I'm not going to go into the psychology of the church or religious people. Many other people much smarter than me have written so much on that topic. But I worry about how many people these days that call themselves Christian are being deluded into a false Christianity. Kierkegaard criticized the church for making Christianity too easy and comfortable. He believed that individual faith was the central core of Christianity, and this couldn't be mediated by the church or external rites. Kierkegaard thought the church was presenting Christianity as a routine, a passive acceptance of doctrine, routine attendance, and church membership. He opposed the notion that being a Christian is a cultural identity or following a set of norms. He argued that Christianity required this existential leap of faith, which is sort of like an intense personal commitment to God. For Kierkegaard, true Christianity isn't about belonging to a church, it's about being radically committed to following Jesus. He understands true Christianity to be deeply uncomfortable. It requires struggle, risk, commitment. It's characterized by self-denial, personal suffering, and individual commitment before God. He considered people's reliance on the church as a way of people avoiding confronting this spiritual struggle that is at the heart of Christianity. He emphasized this leap of faith where people need to confront their existential despair and make this unconditional commitment to God. It's deeply personal and beyond rational understanding. Kierkegaard's philosophy can be complicated. Kierkegaard emphasized that authentic Christianity involves a radical commitment to obeying God. He argued that this is a difficult path and not everyone can confront this sort of existential despair. Now, around 2.5 billion people around the world call themselves Christian. But how many people can call themselves Christians in the way that Kierkegaard describes?
And even between us as conservative Christians, we identify in different belief systems.
There's definitely people who call themselves Christians and they really aren't Christians in this sense from the way that they behave. Obviously, we can't know their internal states or what personal issues that they're dealing with, but there's an intuitive understanding that we can judge certain behaviors to reflect internal states. Like if I protest and throw slurs at a gay soldier's funeral, I can claim that I'm Christian, but these behaviors are so radically incompatible with what Jesus would do that it's hard to say that you're a true representation of Christianity. That's one extreme example just for illustration. But I think what Kierkegaard is suggesting is that there's more moderate versions. What Kierkegaard is suggesting is that there are a lot of these people who call themselves Christians that aren't really Christians in the true sense as Kierkegaard understands it. C.S. Lewis calls them lukewarm Christians, but you can also call them, say, the casual or Sunday Christian. If Kierkegaard is right, then these people also aren't Christians in the true sense because they behave in a way that doesn't reflect an absolute unconditional commitment to God. They follow the rites and rituals of Christianity. They go through the motions of being a churchgoer. They might even be a better person for following the moral example of Jesus Christ, but they haven't made the radical leap of faith that's required to be a true Christian. They haven't fully committed their lives to God, or else their lives would be radically different. It would be fully committed to Christ. C.S. Lewis seems to agree with Kierkegaard in as far as Christianity being an all or nothing thing. He writes, "Christianity, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. Either Christianity is true, there is a God, and your entire way of seeing the world is turned upside down, or there isn't, and who cares about some fake religion? I wouldn't waste my time with Christianity if it wasn't true. I could get a better moral education elsewhere. I could find a better social club. But I do think it's true, and it's the core of my entire being. It gives me a happiness and fulfillment that I really can't explain. And I want other people to have that. But it can't be done by trying to shove religion down other people's throats. And the real tragedy is that people are so off-put by the current state of Christianity that they won't even consider it. Christianity needs to regain its trust with the people of the world.
Sorry, I don't know. Sorry.
Now what? We're either in heaven or a padded room at a mental asylum. The latter seems more plausible with this one. In this day and age, it might be helpful to approach Christianity, spirituality, religion from a philosophical lens. Not to get all highfalutin, but what is religion but a set of philosophical commitments that we try to put into action? I know, typical philosophy major wants to shove philosophy into every conversation. Sorry, I'm trying to make use of my degree, okay? But a lot of religion overlaps with philosophical questions. You have metaphysics, or what is the universe like? Is it all just material things, or are there non-material substances like God or an afterlife? You have ethics. How do we structure our morality, and how do we make these value judgments or ethical choices? Or philosophy of mind. What's so unique about this thing we call conscious experience? Is there something special about humans or the human mind? You have epistemology, or how we come to know things. What are the limits of the scientific method? And what does it mean to trust certain sources of information and include them in our beliefs? And you have existential questions, like, what is the meaning of life? What are we doing here? What is the purpose of all this? These are a lot of questions that both philosophy and religion try to answer. And if you don't like religion, maybe try to enter it from philosophy. Or, just do a bunch of shrooms and acid and see where that leads. Existential philosophy is probably the most relevant here. Kierkegaard wrote, "Deep within every human being, there still lives an anxiety over the possibility of being alone in the world, forgotten by God, overlooked among the millions and millions in this enormous household. One keeps this anxiety at a distance by looking at the many round about who are related to him as kin and friends. But the anxiety is still there, nevertheless, and one hardly dares to think of how he would feel if it were all taken away." Some regard Kierkegaard as the daddy of existentialism. Sorry, father. Existentialism is a philosophical movement that emphasizes personal responsibility, freedom, individual choices in a world full of uncertainty, absurdity, and an apparent lack of meaning.
You think God sees me?
You must close your eyes.
God, have pity on me.
And me?
On me. Pity on me.
I don't think argumentation or reasoning is what brings people to beliefs. Any beliefs. If you spent any time looking into this area of research, you'll know that our reasoning is deeply integrated with our emotions. Reasoning devoid of emotions is not just pure reasoning, it's pathology. It's a deficiency. Before being fully open to exploring Christianity, it's important to let go of all the baggage, the emotional baggage you might have around the church, your experiences with religion, and any other things that could really bias your judgment. And I think everyone owes it to themselves to investigate what true Christianity really is. I know it's weird and uncomfortable, and the idea of Christianity or religion in general can be deeply unappetizing. But you don't say you don't like Chinese food because you don't like General Tao chicken at the mall. You gotta go to China and experience the real thing. Even if you call yourself a Christian now, you might just be experiencing the mall food version of Christianity. It's an experience that transforms and shapes your entire being and how you see the world. And it's hard to describe until you're in it and experiencing it. It feels so fundamental. And everybody has beliefs that are fundamental. Like, how do you know the external world exists? It's a bit theoretical, but how do you know you're not just some brain in a vat with chemicals and electrodes being stimulated, and it gives this illusion of conscious experience that you're going through? How do you know the past exists and these aren't just fake memories implanted into your brain? How can you prove that other minds exist? We can't really know for sure, but we know on a fundamental level. These aren't scientific questions because they can't be answered in empirical ways or through the methods that we have. They're what philosophers call properly basic beliefs. They're beliefs that we sort of have direct access to their truth. They're foundational. The phenomenology of Christianity, the relationship with Jesus, it's the same thing. Anyway, what now? Take baby steps. Start by looking at the existence of God. What do non-religious academics have to say about God? What do other religions say about God? What does Christianity say about God? One day this path might lead you to maybe follow Jesus. Obey him and see what it's like to have a relationship with him. Or not, you know. Is that too preachy? I don't know. It kind of comes off as sanctimonious, you know? In all white background. A very holier than thou. Am I holier than thou? Absolutely not. I am filthy. Hi, have you heard the good news of Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior? He died for your sins.